Thank you, everyone, for making our adjusted time and being here live for this. As I said, we will take questions at the end, so you can use either that or there's the Q&A button you'll see on your screen. You can put them there, and then we'll go through those at the end. But yeah, so grateful for your being with us today. And I'm going to introduce our guest in a second, but first I'll tell you who I am. My name is Mike Jordan Laskey. I'm the Communications Director of the Jesuit Conference of Canada and the US, based in Washington, D.C. And we've been doing these Jesuit book clubs since right in the beginning of COVID. We started just kind of by happenstance, right before kind of COVID descended. Nick and I had started, and we've done these great live author events, and we're so excited to have Pádraig with us today. Can also tell you, if you're interested in these intersection of spirituality and writing literature, we also have a podcast, AMDG, which is a weekly conversation podcast. We've had some great writers on that show, including Nick, Mary Carr. We've done interviews with Alice McDermott, Kirsten Valdez-Quaid, really just terrific writers. So there's another good place to find us if you're interested in more of this stuff in this intersection. And we do have your email address, so you can rest assured we'll let you know about our next online gathering. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to record this because I know some folks couldn't make it live, but we'll be able, and we'll send the recording out to everyone who registered within the next day or so. So you'll have access to that. So, I think it already is recording. So great. So I don't have to turn that on. So now let me introduce our two guests, our guest of honor today, Pádraig Tuama. So Pádraig is a poet and theologian, and his work centers on themes of language, power, conflict, and religion. For Tuama, religion, conflict, power, and poetry all circle around language, the original sacrament. Working fluently on the page and in public, he is a compelling poet and skilled speaker, teacher, and group worker. He presents poetry Unbound with On Being Studios, and from 2014 to 2019 was the leader of the Corrymeela community, Ireland's oldest peace and reconciliation community. With undergraduate and postgraduate degrees in theology, multiple professional qualifications in conflict mediation, he also holds a PhD in poetry and theology from the University of Glasgow. When BBC journalist William Crawley introduced Pádraig on the stage to deliver a TEDx talk on story, Crawley said, "He's probably the best public speaker I know." And profiling Tuama in The New Yorker, journalist and poet Eliza Griswold wrote, "Poetry for him is the language the heart speaks, not when it reaches for some externalized divinity, but when it seeks to understand itself." Tuama's published work incorporates poetry, prose, and theology, and in addition to appearing regularly on national radio stations in Ireland, the UK, the US, and Australia, his poetry has been featured in Poetry Ireland Review, Academy of American Poets, Radio Tafelis's Aaron's Poem of the Week, Kenyon Review, the New England Review of Books, and others. Pádraig Tuama, you're very welcome to the Jesuit Book Club.
Thanks very much, Mike. I think I should also put something in one of those intros to say Pádraig is a fan of short introductions. So.
No, well, we're again very grateful to have you and to read off all of your list of accolades. Nick Ripatrazone also has a long list of accolades. He is a writer, editor, and teacher, and has yet another new book, The Habit of Poetry: The Literary Lives of Nuns in Mid-Century America, which is just out and available from Fortress Press. I think I see it over your shoulder, Nick. His other books include Digital Communion, Marshall McLuhan's Spiritual Vision for a Virtual Age, Longing for an Absent God, Faith and Doubt and Great American Fiction, and Wild Belief, Poets and Prophets in the Wilderness. And those are both from Broadleaf Books. Nick is the culture editor for the Image Journal, which is a quarterly magazine that seeks to publish the best writing and artwork informed by or grappling with religious faith. He's also a contributing editor of the Catholic Herald in the UK, where he covers American Catholic culture and artists, and has written for Rolling Stone, GQ, The Atlantic, Paris Review, Esquire, Outside, the Sewanee Review, America, Commonweal, and elsewhere. Nick, you're very welcome as well. Thanks so much for being here.
Great to be here.
Great. So we're talking today about the wonderful volume, Pádraig, you put together, Poetry Unbound, which is connected to your podcast, in which you introduce us to poets and their work. And so we're going to talk about that. And then at the end, we'll ask you to read one of your own poems. And then again, we'll remind folks too, if they have questions, we'll get to them at the end. But if you want to leave them in the chat or the Q&A, we will make sure to answer as many as we have time for. So with that, I'll turn it over to Nick to get us started.
And thanks again, everybody, for joining us. I'm so happy to speak with Pádraig. I've been such a fan of your work for so long, and it's really cool to have this like virtual moment. So I want to start with a question. I was struck by a section from the introduction to your book. And you wrote, quote, "Most people remember a poem because it reminds them of something, a grief of their own, a moment of love in their life, a decision they had to make, a time of wonder and delight, a landscape they had forgotten, a pain they carried. Somehow those little clockworks get into the heart and help it go, help it rhyme, help it in ways that we can't define." It's a wonderful sentiment. And this idea that poetry stays with us and that certain poems can be almost like a refrain in our lives. And there's also a metaphorical union of the body with poetry that makes the art form feel really necessary and human. And Poetry Unbound is full of such poems. So I'd like to start with one poem that currently helps your heart go. That's a poem that helps you perhaps in a way that you, quote, can't define.
There's one from the book that we did in Poetry Unbound a few years ago called On Listening to Your Teacher Take Attendance by Amy Nizuka-Matato. And I love this poem. I'll say a little bit why beforehand, because, it's somebody who's been moving a lot and therefore in a new class yet again, and hearing your name being butchered by the teacher, and the only person of color in a new class. And so there's this sense of isolation as well as systemic complication in terms of what's going on that isn't just about a personal experience, but it's a broader experience. And she recalls time with intimate people, in her instance, family, but also recalls nature. And so there's this way about what time can do. There's a certain metaphysic of time that occurs in the poem, even in the imagination of a teenager in the first day in a new school when everybody's staring at you as your name's being mispronounced. But there's a metaphysic about what time can do. And poetry, or any art really, music, scent, it's not just art, it's sentiments. They have a way of drawing you into some other experience of time. And that can be a kind comfort in the moment. It doesn't solve anything. It's always important to say, I don't think of poetry as the antidote to bad government. I don't think that poetry will save the world, but it can help. And so I love the intuition of this poem. And I've been turning a lot. I had a bad day last week and I took a walk around the lake and I saw a cardinal and a bluebird and a young deer. And it didn't change anything, but it changed something. So anyway. Here's the poem by Amy Nizuka-Matato. She's a fantastic, it's from a book called Oceanic. On Listening to Your Teacher Take Attendance by Amy Nizuka-Matato. Breathe deep, even if it means you wrinkle your nose from the fake lemon antiseptic of the mopped floors and wiped down doorknobs, the freshly soaped necks and armpits. Your teacher means well, even if he butchers your name like he has a bloody sausage casing stuck between his teeth, handprints on his white sloppy apron. And when everyone turns around to check out your face, no need to flush red and warm. Just picture all the eyes as if your classroom is one big scallop with its dozens of icy blues, and you will remember that winter your family took you to the China Sea and you sank your face into it to gaze at baby clams and sea stars the size of your outstretched hand. And when all those necks start to crane, try not to forget someone once lathered their bodies, once patted them dry with a fluffy towel after a bath, set out their clothes for the first day of school. Think of their pencil cases from third grade, full of sharp pencils, a pink pearl eraser. Think of their handheld pencil sharpener and its tiny blade.
I'm so happy you chose that one because I was thinking if there's a poet who's kind of on your wavelength, because Nizuka-Matato, her book of nonfiction, World of Wonders, I feel like that's such a thing that you would appreciate. So I just want to say I'm really happy you chose that one.
She's great. I interviewed her last year. I think we might be releasing the interview sometime soon about her erotic poetry. She's so fluent in such a variety of levels of poems. Yeah, she's brilliant. Mike, I think you're muted.
Thanks for starting us that way, Pádraig. And I do want to ask now kind of about the way you put this volume together, and I guess about your whole project of Poetry Unbound. So again, presenting this anthology, but it's more than an anthology. It's a guided curation, this coexistence between poetry and prose. And so your commentaries after the work, to me, I love them. They just feel like, I think kind of when to step back. They're not too long. They're not self-indulgent. Really, I think help invite us in to consider poetry. I know for me, sometimes poetry can feel intimidating, but you invite us in to consider these and almost feel kind of like poetic exegesis. You kind of go into the language and to affirm that poetry itself is sacred and holy and this language worthy of care. And even in one example, in the poem Book of Genesis by Kai Miller, you move among memoir, biblical translation, meditations on language and reading. And I'm curious for you in this process as a poet going into this project of Poetry Unbound, like what have you learned about poetry and maybe even yourself through this experience of contemplating poems and then coming up with thoughts to match with them?
Well, first, I think there's a few influences on the approach that I take and the approach that we take in Poetry Unbound on the podcast as well, and obviously in writing the book, in terms of how to respond to a poem. One of which is that a poem is a public text, and that literary criticism isn't just about literary technique, but literary criticism is about how literature is in conversation with lived experience. Which isn't to say they have to dovetail or that it has to say, here, this poem provides a template for what to do in this circumstance. None of that. But it is to say that this poem arose from a person in a circumstance and that there's something interesting and intelligent happening. I've always thought that, a piece of art obviously can be commented upon by the artist, but a piece of art is also and always, if it lasts, going to be in conversation with people far beyond when that artist is known or unknown, living or dead. And so there is a way within which each art invites a certain kind of anarchic engagement that separates the artist from the art. So I want to find a way where we can look at a poem and analyze it in such a way that I can point out a few of the techniques, but also invite people to say, where does it land for you? Which isn't about saying, this is what the poet meant. Maybe we'll never know what the poet meant. Maybe the poet doesn't know what the poet meant. But what we can do is to give folks the technology and the techniques to say, when I heard that word, my mind went here. That's great. That's not ascribing intentionality to the poet. It is simply saying, here's an association, almost like a psychoanalysis of the text. And in all of that, I'm very grateful for, I don't know how many years it was, 15 years of theological training, where you're looking at ancient text and having to do a lot of deep work in terms of Hebrew and Greek to know how not to make mistakes, but then really carving out a sense for your own self to say, and in the midst of this, here's how my life meets this text today, 2,000 years later, 3,000 years later after the text was written. And that there is a freedom in that, and that the literature is in conversation with the literature of your life. And that is at the heart. In a certain sense, it's an experiment in the art of personal essay, using the poem as the text in between us and thinking, let's take a close reading of the text and then allow the text of the poem to do a close reading of our lives.
I can only imagine that you come across folks who have been challenged by poetry. You hear from people who are like, oh, I struggle with it. I don't know what it means. It intimidates me. It sounds like, again, I think the book is a great example of how you invite people in, even when at first glance, the work might feel difficult or difficult to understand. What are some of those ways for you that you try to emphasize for people? How do we approach a poem, even something that might be difficult to read or make sense of?
Yeah, Marie Howe, she's actually visiting at the moment. We're both in Cork on the south coast of Ireland. She's downstairs. She has this great thing when she's teaching Emily Dickinson, where she'd say to her classes, has anybody here ever had a panic attack? And people who wish to in the class would put their hand up, and she'd say, tell me what it feels like in your body, and is there a simile or a metaphor? And people would do whatever they want to do. And then she'd go, great. Now we're going to read what Emily Dickinson said about what might have been similar. I felt a funeral in my brain. And so partly it's an act of narrative hospitality. by asking a way within which you'd say, if you were prompted to try to choose a metaphor or language to respond to this stimulus in your life or this prompt, what would you do? Where would you go? What story would you choose? What mythology would you choose? What image from nature would you choose? What character from literature would you choose to have a conversation with? And so people are kind of tricked into thinking, randomly, I've got 30 seconds to decide. And then to say, great, now let's look at this classic. And it's not to say that that's exactly what that person was doing, but it might have been. And so there's something really, there's a great companionship, therefore, is created between the possibility of artistic inspiration that occurs. And again, you're not saying that this is an accurate record about where this particular poem emerged, but it is saying poems emerge from things like this. And that might be a way within which a person can feel that they have a new relationship with a poem. So often in the Poetry Unbound book, before each poem, there's half a page, a paragraph. That's often some kind of light anecdote from my life, which is kind of meant to really, people aren't meant to remember that, really. My hope is that people read that and go, oh, I've got something like that they're listening to themselves as they're reading it, and that is meant, in a certain sense, to open up some narrative curiosity, so that when you turn the page, you think, oh, I already have an association. And then here's a poem that is doing something similar, so that there's a way in which the book is trying to invite people to read a poem with their life, as well as read a poem carefully. Like of the many things that I ascribe gratitude for is an education in theology where it was absolutely necessary to do a profoundly close reading of a text. If you're going to say anything about a text, read it forwards, read it backwards, read it many times, try to learn a few lines off, close your eyes, think what you can recall. Like, these things just become second nature when you're studying ancient text. And so I don't just use a poem as a bouncing off pad to say whatever I think. I try to do a close reading of it. And I think the poet deserves that. But so our lives also then deserve that, to not just think, oh, what would I know about the poet? It doesn't matter. You might know nothing about the poet. But what you can do is to say, I've read the poem carefully, and now I can read my life carefully. And here's the conversation between the two.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, that's such a smart, and I think, for me, illuminating way to consider, like, the efficacy of the text. Like it's integral. It matters, and yet at the same time, it's generative. It's such a smart way to kind of encapsulate it, because you're right that we don't have to maybe choose of the two options. They can both kind of live. So I feel like, for people who maybe are hesitant about poetry, that's such a smart way to offer it to them.
I mean, I can give you an example. Somebody came up to me at a reading a few weeks ago, and they had read a Martina Spada poem that's inside this book, After the Geese Who Rose Like the God of Geese. And it's a beautiful poem. His father had died, and he had been away, and he had to get a flight, and all of these arrangements. And then he just had this ridiculous impulse to go and feed geese. And he went, and the geese were unruly, especially this one particular bastard of a goose. And it was harsh and hissing and, going after the bread that was in his outstretched hand. And there was something releasing and cathartic in the rage of the goose that wasn't about calming down grief, but was allowing grief to explode in a certain sense. And there was a strange comfort that came with it. So someone came up to me after this reading and said, can I talk to you? And said, can I talk to you about Martina Spada's poem? And this person had recently enough been bereaved. Her own father had died. Tony. I asked her father's name, and she told me his name was Tony. And she just described what it was like to be seized with an impulse, and that when she was seized with a particular impulse about doing something, going for a walk or going to the sea, or that it was the realization that this poem had let her know it's okay. You don't have to explain whatever that impulse is. Maybe there's an instinctual part of you that has a recognition of the element that you're seeking to find some conversation with. And the poem was a companion to her, as she was a companion to herself in her grief, as she was trying to think about how to pay attention to the grief of Tony. And I was so moved by thinking about what a poem can do. That isn't to say that that's the only thing a poem can do, or that poems have purposes. I think we write poems for different reasons than strategic plans. You write a poem because you're moved to, because you have to, and you've worked on the craft and skill of it. But poems do strange things, and that was one of the things that Martina Spada's poem did for somebody in California who told me, and now here's me in Ireland, thinking about her grief, thinking about what she did. It's a lovely, mysterious thing that happens. And the literature of our lives is now wrapped into the generosity of Martina Spada's art.
That's such a great story. And I love that you come back to that word companion or companionship. It's an empathetic way to imagine what poetry can do. And I think it's part of the reason why your work and your podcast has moved so many people, because you're open to that possibility. When I think of kind of companion, in terms of like the project of poetry, I do think of Christian Wyman, who is a poet, who's an essayist, and who appears in this book. And actually, one of your two epigraphs from the book comes from him. And you almost seem like kindred spirits in the way that you look at the possibilities of poetry. And there's an essay that he had written. I think it might have been in Commonweal a few years ago. And I want to quote the end of his essay. He says, "I feel sure that there is some one particular pain to which every one of us is called to witness and perhaps ease. It might be as simple as some phone call to a family member you haven't spoken to in too long. It might be some thorn in the heart of a friend to whom you have not paid sufficient attention. It might be some wholly ordinary encounter you have in the next few hours of this wholly ordinary day, when suddenly you feel some power going out of you. Because make no mistake, Christ is in us. Ours are the only hands he has." End quote. So I was wondering, how might you respond to those lines from his essay?
What's the name of that essay, Vic? Can you recall?
I'll look it up.
I'll find it. I'll find it as you're talking.
I know it's from Commonweal, but I don't remember the exact.
Commonweal.
Yeah.
I know Chris Wyman, so I am currently just transported into admiration for his language and his personhood and his goodness. So that's the first thing that I think of, how nice it is to live in a world where Christian Wyman is writing and writing the kind of things he does. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. What am I thinking as I think of that? Like, he's doing an act of literature, and he's doing an act of life, and he's locating the theological project outside of the question of doctrine, but locating it instead in what he calls the holy ordinary. And I think I really like that. I mean, he's doing some lovely allusions to other literatures, you feel a power going out of you. That's a piece from the Gospel of Mark, and then ours are the only hands that God has, that Christ has, as he puts it. What saint said that?
Teresa of Avila.
Teresa of Avila. I knew it was some European saint. So he's doing, I really like how closely he has read the tradition, and then how broadly he uses it by, not trying to load it with who should know what. I like how he's asking people to pay attention to their lives, which I think is one of the things that he does in his work. Survival as a Style, his latest book, is magnificent. In the midst of asking some very serious questions about existential angst, it's very funny as a book. And so it was a delight to read that, and in it he speaks about cancer and the world and change and midlife and death. And then you're laughing at how him and his family accidentally ended up on a beach with nudists who were rude, and how they all cracked up laughing at the rude nudists. So I admire him so much. And I think his work asks you to pay attention to your life. He isn't a comforting writer. I don't think he seeks to comfort, but there is a lot of comfort that comes from the steady gaze that he holds to life, and the attempt that he has to hold something against despair in the way to live a life.
You mentioned in that reflection some of his vulnerability you've seen in his own work, writing about his life and his poetry. And vulnerability, I think, comes up a lot in your work as well, again, in the way you bring us into your own life and the way poets do. And so I want to ask you about vulnerability in poetry by way of this one quote you share about the work of the craft of poetry. You talk about that you love poems that show their own mistakes deliberately and use that in order to show something about what's happening while you're writing the poem. And so there is this vulnerability you need to write a poem. I imagine we have poets with us on the call, but you also need this kind of confidence and guile, maybe like a willingness to take the chance to reveal yourself through the imperfect vehicle of language. I remember a meeting with a journalist who had won a Pulitzer Prize, and she said every time she submitted a piece for publication, it was like her quavering soul on a plate. So I'm curious for you, do you find those modes of being, this kind of concurrent vulnerability and confidence and guile, as being present in your work in the book or in the podcast also? Just, your reflections on vulnerability and the work.
Well, first of all, I think I could be wrong, but I think one of the place where what you quoted came from, Mike, was talking about Unina Curtin's poem Reconciliation, where she's thinking about herself as an Icelander in Canada and a Métis person, and thinking of these joint tugs of identities, and she's trying to imagine in the first part of the poem a bridge between Métis culture in Canada and Icelander culture in Iceland. And she's imagining an engineered bridge and how flimsy it would be and how complicated and threatening. And then what's great is that the poem in the second part shifts to looking at a living root bridge. And what I thought was the vulnerability was that she started off by using a metaphor that the poem is saying is a metaphor that will fail. And I found deep vulnerability in that. Rather than saying, okay, great, I'm going to get rid of the first part, I'm just going to use the second part of the poem, which is the living root bridge. She used the poem to show the weakness of a metaphor and then improve the metaphor. And I thought there's something about, I don't know her, we've had a couple of correspondences since I made a program about that poem, but to my mind that showed not only craft but also character, and I was really intrigued about character in how she did that. So when it comes to thinking about writing with vulnerability, I suppose, writing is a very lonely art. You're sitting in front of a desk somewhere in front of a screen, or in my case, sitting, in an airport cafe somewhere, writing. And there can be a part of you thinks, I wouldn't be able to say that, that would be too embarrassing, or it would be painful. I mean, I don't write it in a way, hopefully, that would shame or pain other people. That doesn't interest me even. It's not like not like I want to, and I don't. It doesn't interest me to write like that. But there's a way within which there can be a desire to present yourself, perhaps as someone who can hold things together. And I find that when I write in a way that it isn't about the performance of vulnerability, because I'm not interested in vulnerability as performance, but it is about saying, well, this is what's happening. People are moved. And I think I know that because I've been moved when I've read things from other people, where you read it and you think, oh, there we are. Raymond Anthropos, who is one of the poets in the book with this great poem called Miami Airport, he's got some prose books coming out in the next couple of years. Magnificent, serious works of prose and essays. And I've heard some of the early pieces, and like you read what and how he writes, and there's a mixture of pain and sharpness and self-revelation and self-exploration, all contained in these perfectly comprehensible sentences that are nonetheless doing 10 things each. And in that, I see vulnerability and art come together in a very generative way. So, yeah.
Thinking about the book of poems, I really commend your focus in that book on living poets. It really helps to demonstrate that poetry is a living and breathing art form. It's something that we can access and participate in the present. In the book, you, though, also acknowledge that poetry does have, of course, a long history. And I think that tradition can both really challenge and encourage us simultaneously in very deep ways. So I was wondering, who were the poets whose work was formative in your early years as a poet? Who were the poets who were writers who helped you see appreciate the possibilities of poetry?
Well, I'm very lucky because in the Irish education system, we were learning poems off by heart in 2 languages from the age of 5 onwards every week. And this is just in the ordinary village school, not in a fancy school. although the village teachers might want to say, we were very fancy, Pádraig. I'm not sure. So there are so many poets whose work influenced me. At the start of lockdown, I decided to read all of W.B. Yeats's work, because while I'd read a lot of it, I hadn't read it in order, in a kind of a chronological order. And I realized there was scarcely a publication that came out from his life where there weren't some of the poems that at one point during my 12 years in school that I didn't have off by heart. So Yeats, whether I like him or not, Yeats was a huge influence. And the musicality of his language and his interest in mythology and his interest in politics, his interest in poems that became increasingly simple as years went by. The early stuff is skilled and sometimes pretentious. And he's so skilled that the pretentiousness is forgivable. But he wrote later on about, I take this bit out of that bit out of that bit out. And I really appreciate those self-critiques that he offered too. I learned a lot from reading those. So Yeats is everywhere. There was a poet, Nuala Ní Dhomhnaill, who walked into our classroom when I was 12. She was poet in residence in the university in Cork. And our teacher must have known her, our Irish teacher. And she recited her poems. She only ever writes in Irish. Other people translate her work into English. And she was the first living poet I'd met. And there was something overwhelmingly brilliant about meeting her and hearing her recite her work. And then there was a translation of one of the poems, which somebody in the class read. And she talked about the experience of being translated, which in a bilingual context was a really powerful thing to experience that at the age of 12. Maybe I was 13. Yeah, it was the first year in secondary school, so I would have been 13. So she had a big influence. Patrick Kavanagh, another Irish poet, he hated where he was from, and he had a profoundly ambivalent relationship with Irishness, and he had an ambition which probably would have made him a difficult, if not unpleasant man to be around if you got on the wrong side of him. And his angst about being a poor rural person with literary ambition suffused his work, and I hated him as a teenager. I hated reading his work. I remember objecting in English class to Mrs. Corcoran, our teacher, just saying, like, if he hated his life so much, why did he write about it so often? Like, for God's sake, shut up. And yet, when I moved away from Ireland, I was seized with this desire to turn to him, because I had ambivalences in my life, and it was his faithfulness to his ambivalence about his experience that I really admired, in a resentful way. And like my sister, who I see tomorrow, we were literally in Cork City. I was about to get a plane to Australia, and I said, I need to go into a shop. I went into the bookshop and bought selected poems of Patrick Kavanagh. And Ciara said, I thought you hated him. And I was like, I do. I don't know why I need this book. So those are just some early ones that come to mind. Martin O'Durjoin, Irish language poet as well, whose work really, really moved me deeply, and I couldn't explain why. So many. And those are just the Irish ones.
How do you relate to your own Irishness in that way? Do you see, like, how does it influence your work? I'm curious. People reacting, so many great writers from such a small place.
I know, so many great writers. I see somebody's asking, yes, Patrick Kavanagh with a K, yeah. It's interesting to be Irish. I mean, what do I know about being from anywhere else? I think everywhere is an interesting place to be from. There's a way within which the intensity of a small country occurs with an explosive history, which you could say about everywhere. But it does mean that when you're from a small country, you are always aware of the history of the largest country near you. And so when I meet people who know nothing about outside their country, typically they're from a really big country. And there's forgive me for saying this, there's an arrogance to thinking that can be the center of the world. And when you can always tell when someone's from a smaller country. You turn on the news and what's happening here is on the news, but also what's happening over there, because what's happening over there is going to influence us here. And so that does something to your worldview. And I'm from a country where we have our own language, and most of us speak in the other language, in English. And so that does something about paying attention to the past, about why that language has been influenced. But also in the contemporary sense, it does something about where do you pay attention to power, and how do you pay attention to power, and how do you pay attention to elections that are going to influence you, but you know that that's don't have a vote in. And so those things influence me about being Irish, and as well as a deep pride about coming from a place where poets and politics have been overlapping for centuries. I'm very proud to be part of an Irish tradition in poetry. I really find that moving, as well as then great sense of being seized with accountability for the witness of Irish people like me overseas. So it's easy to just think, oh, because we suffered under the hand of empire, that therefore we're the friends of those who've suffered elsewhere. That's not necessarily true. So pride and accountability, both.
You share from your own life these anecdotes we've mentioned kind of before, these short ones that you said maybe not meant to be remembered, but to let people kind of go into that space to kind of put their own lives into dialogue with the work. And there's one I wanted to ask you about specifically. I'll quote from one of the things it's not much of a story here. It's more your reflection on the story. One of the things I love, but also fear about poetry is that it asks you to name deep truths. It asks you to lament, to remove shallow comforts in order to let the truth of what you wish to say be said. When I write poems, I feel like they ask me questions and there's no room for deceit of myself or others. End quote. We've gotten into some of these ideas a little bit, but I'm curious for you about the idea. We talked about vulnerability some, but also truth and poetry. Do you find poetry is a practice that enables you to discover truths, or do you feel that they are received rather than found? How do you see poetry and truth going together?
Yeah, well, this is a philosophical question in a certain sense about what is truth. I'm not speaking about truth here as propositional, here's something that's true about the universe or true about the human condition even, because who am I to say, who is anyone to say, here's what's universal? But there is something, I think, in saying, am I telling the truth in my poem? Not am I defining global truth, but am I telling the truth in my poem? Or is my poem trying to enact an act of deceit? Am I trying to impress, or am I trying to humble brag, or am I trying to whatever? There's a desire in me that a really well-crafted sentence has also been written with a scalpel, where I can go, how can the art of writing this and the sense of asking yourself a damn fine question be demonstrated in the choice of language that goes in there, and to ask that am I telling the truth? Not am I defining the truth for other people or telling people what they should believe. That's none of my business. But it is to ask me, am I telling the truth? Or am I using the poem as an act of manipulation? Or is it what Tracy K. Smith calls a tract? If I'm trying to use my poem to manipulate people into voting one way or agreeing with me or something, she's like, just write a tract, let the literary form do. If you want to convince people, use a form that is open and telling the truth about the fact that it's trying to convince people of something. So therefore, the question in me is, what's the poem? What's the truth of the poem? And is the truth of the poem an exploration? Is the truth of the poem something that has to turn and look back at me? It's that kind of level of truth. And for me, that is as serious a question as the question of form in a poem when I write it, that I need it to be able to turn back, and I need to be able to look at it and go, that has the integrity for me, rather than it being me engaging in a subtle art of manipulation.
So you're writing and reading poetry, but also working in politics, broadly fashioned, right? In the peace building work, and that's clearly area of deep passion for you. And you talked about how those have come together in Irish literature. Now, I'm curious for you, though, as someone who is writing poetry and not tracts, how those go together, the poetry, the political obligations, or those things. Like, can a great poem be, as you said, it's not going to tell us how to vote, but sometimes there's certainly poetry that is more overtly political or even bordering on partisan. So for you, just curious for you, how do you navigate those intersections?
Delicately, and I'm sure I fail. So I think that's the first thing to say. I look back at some of the stuff that I wrote before and think, it's not like I disagree with it, but part of me thinks I could have done a little bit more work in earlier days of editing. I used to feel embarrassed about that. And then I read that Rabindranath Tagore said, and in fact, no, Lorna Goodison, who is a poet whose work is in the book, she and I were talking, and she said that Rabindranath Tagore had said that, your first pieces of poems that you publish might be the ones that you feel are the most naive, but also the ones with and insight. And I took great comfort in that. If he can say that, well, then I can rest easy. Um, I Yeah. So the first thing to say is I think I probably failed. Um, like I do want language to have a certain moral imagination. I do want language to not just think, oh, here, I'm just going to explode things for the sake of exploding. I do think that art has, maybe responsibility is too limited a word, but art is in a conversation with life. And, just exploding things for the sake of exploding them, I'm not sure that that's something, well, art would need to be able to defend itself from that. So I do think that there is some kind of imagination in art about being in conversation with life. And that's a tension I try to hold when it comes to writing stuff that's in conversation with Irish life today, for instance, or being a gay man today, or being a man today, or being white today, or trying to figure out all these ways of it. Especially if I think I've got a point to declaim or to confess on behalf of myself. How can I do that in a way that isn't just about saying, "Look how enlightened I am"? Why don't all you other fools get enlightened like me? That's a pretty boring poem, and its imagination of the you is limited. And it's putting me in a situation where I am taking the voice of the enlightened one, even the previously mistaken, but now enlightened. And in that way, the characterization of the I and the you in the poem is really impoverished. And I want if I'm going to write a poem, I want the characterization of the I and the you, or the we or the they. Those pronouns are really subtle, and they in conflict. I, you, we, they are pronouns upon which negotiations are lost if you use them weakly, or if you use them where they display your hatred for someone else, or your entitlement, or your arrogance, or your mistakes, or assumptions or lies. So I'm interested in how poems can be subtle about I, you, we, they. Again, not to fall into, but to do the work of art, to do the work of a poem that's trying to explore something. Don Patterson says a poem is a little machine for remembering itself. And I love that definition of a poem being a little machine for remembering itself. And remembering isn't just recalling the past or recalling a certain line of a biography. Remembering is about remembering yourself again. And who is the self? Is it me? Is it the living and the dead? Is it my community, my culture? What is it? What is being remembered? What is it? What has to fall apart in order for something to be remembered again? And I love the idea that a poem can be one of the things that contributes to that strange work. And that, I think, is a political act, but it wouldn't be good policy, but it's not trying to be. If you want to write good policy, write good policy. And I'm glad for really well written policy. But I think a poem can also has got some anarchic work to do about the complexity of being human. And often the imagination in policy, and the imagination in public political communication is we don't want to be too complex because we need things to be comprehensible. But what a poem knows is that everybody's complex, and that everybody is a multitude, and everybody is holding sophisticated lives, and you manage your hatred of the people that you love the most in a way that by and large is fairly fruitful. And a poem can tell that truth.
So much of what you just said and your work is deeply, I think, contemplative and attentive. And it's interesting to juxtapose that with the reality that it seems you do a fair amount of traveling, that you're going here and there and everywhere to speak and to participate in workshop and lead teaching. And I think, because we do have a fair amount, I think, of writers who are watching this. And I'd be curious to hear how someone can be all over the place in a way and find those spaces to slow down and to contemplate and to write. How do you do that as a writer?
It's a tension, Nick. I'm not entirely sure. Certainly I've had rhythms that have worked, and those rhythms might need to change. I've had a very intense number of years, and so there are some manuscripts that are finished and written. I hadn't published a book of poetry in 10 years, even though I was writing intensely, all that. So that there's a lot that might look like, oh God, I'm writing all the time and being really productive today. When you go, actually, no, this is stuff that's been worked on in 10 years. Poems aren't that fast. I everybody has to find a way to make a living, and I'm a working artist. So I have multiple contracts with multiple groups, one of which is Unbound, which I love. And so partly for me, it's just a matter of going on, here's my chosen profession. And all of us, have to find a way to pay the bills, to be able to pay for the bus. And this is how at the moment it's working for me. I've been self-employed for a long time, and I know that the contours of being self-employed mean that you take on short contracts and then longer ones, and usually working a year in advance. And so, I've done that for most of 20 years. Even when I was with Coromila, I was a contractor as a leader there, and it wasn't full time because I was always doing bits of travel and bits of writing, occasional book tours during those 5 years as well. So, because I knew that I'd only do that job for 5 years. So partly I've had in Irish you'd say I've been a farfán, a wandering man, for 20 years. So I'm pretty used to it. But I will say that I do have some techniques, one of which is a damn fine mug for tea. So the other, which I can give you a little demonstration, is really good slippers. So slippers and tea and early mornings. Those three things, and they seem flippant, but they're not. They're really serious for me. Tea, 5 a.m., and slippers, and something to read, something to write. It means that despite the fact that I'm traveling a lot, that a lot of the mornings look the same wherever I am.
Well, thank you for that and for the visual demonstration.
You're very welcome.
Well.
My apologies.
No, terrific. We're going to be on Zoom. Might as well use it. We have moved a little bit into your craft now, and we talked about some other poets. I'd love for you to share one of your own poems with us as a way kind of closing out this bit of our time. And we will have time for a couple of questions. So people want to use the Q&A or the chat, they can do that. But only right now. So you're listening to the poem that Pádraig will recite or read for us.
And this is a very short poem called The One Thing. I do love science fiction, and this is the imagination of alternative universes, parallel universe theory, and that there was a slightly older Pádraig. The one thing. There must have been some other me who lived some other time, who realized he knew the one thing that would save me. And he must have found a window, opened it, and shouted through it that saving sound that saved me. And he must have felt a failure, I am sure, that other me, because he failed. He didn't save me from the things that beat me. And he must have sat like some sad God from sadder scriptures and wept at all he failed to do. He had so little time. And all my life, I've been climbing up to little windows, opening them and saying the one thing I can say. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Pádraig, for that. A great way to wrap up this portion of our time. So we can. I feel like that
other Pádraig, the thing that he shouted through the other window was poetry. That he just shouted one word, or maybe he said "Danta" in Irish. That there was one word, and that has been the thing that has held me together.
We have a question from my friend Ed in Philadelphia, who is curious about, he's listening to Paul Simon's 7 Psalms right now, which is Paul Simon's newest record, and curious for you about lyricists or songwriters, how they connect to your experience and understanding of poets and poetry.
All praise to Paul Simon. I haven't listened to that yet because I want to listen to it when I've got time. But I listen to Graceland and I know every single word of every single song. I just think, how did you do that? The lyrics are so interesting because they're often dealing in tight form with strict syllabic counts and rhyming sequences, and yet they seem fluid and moving. So I absolutely love Paul Simon. I love Michelle Schacht as well as a teenager. I found her work brilliant and moving and funny. And you saw in her a working artist too, who would say, here's a ditty I wrote when I had a job writing advertisements for radio, and you saw what that would be like. What else would be? There are so many. As a teenager, I lost my heart to a musician, Tanisha Tikram. She was a teenager herself, and she was 19. I think I was about 13, and she wrote incomprehensible songs and set them to melodies. And I have a deep love for lyrics that make no sense, whether in a song or in a poem. And I do really think that it wasn't Emily Dickinson, it was Tanisha Tikram. And we follow each other on Twitter now. And at one point I said to her that one of her most utterly incomprehensible songs, Twisting My Sobriety, she did very well with it in the 80s. I said, I used to give little lectures to my unfortunate friends about what that song meant. And she said, could you tell me? Because I haven't a clue, So she now, 30 years later, looks back in those lyrics with amusement, about the strange things that teenagers need to write. But it really shaped my imagination about what's possible. So I could go on and on about musicians whose work I appreciate and the deep respect for lyrics. Leonard Cohen just got better and better and better.
Some interesting stories about the way Cohen's writing, very, iterative, over and over again, dozens of verses to songs, always going back in that song, Hallelujah, that famous song of his, writing all of these verses, versus other artists who sometimes would explode in a very prolific hour and have a song and be done with it. It's just those different ways.
It's interesting, isn't it?
Because if people have a last couple of questions we can take, but since this is the Jesuit book club, Pádraig, I do have to ask you, if there have been any Jesuit influences in your life, or things from Jesuit spirituality or tradition that you find appealing. I wouldn't be earning my paycheck if I did not ask you.
Yeah. Somebody asked Michelle Volz, you were asking who Michelle Shocked, Shocked. Well, the Jesuit who's influenced me most is is Ignatius. I'm culturally Catholic, of course, but I'm not falling into the question of doctrinal belief or any of those kinds of belongings. But my education, my history, my country, all these things are so Catholic. It's in me like DNA, whether I like it or not. And going to a spiritual director 20 years ago, who was a Jesuit an Ignatian spiritual director, who introduced me to, in many ways, the very practical wisdom of Ignatius of Loyola, ways about discerning the spirits, considerations to keep in mind when you're asking a good question, the invitation that when you're reading a text that you think, what's the one thing I want to ask for in light of this text? Not the 20, just the one. And how do I want to pay attention to that? And this review that he often encouraged people to do about their own prayer life, which I think works whether or not you're praying in the religious context formally, or whether you're just having a meditation, where he'd say, note down the one thing you're hoping for in each of those, and maybe once a week, and then once a month, once a season, once a year. Just cast an eye over what you did, not as a strategic analysis, but cast an eye. And after a few years of doing that, he says, you begin to discern the spirits in you. I found that so helpful. And I think it's relevant wherever, his idea about at the end of the day, doing a review of the day and thinking, where in this day did things move unexpectedly towards consolation? And then where in this day did I get caught in the whirlpool of desolation? And to just notice those things. And by practicing the art of that, you begin to notice it while it's happening more and more. Those things have changed and influenced my life, in and out of belief, in and out of feeling affiliated with the church, in and out of having fury at the church or whatever. Ignatius has been a steady for me, and I think he always will be.
Well, Pádraig Tuama, thank you so much for taking the time. Nick, thank you so much for the thoughtful questions and being here, and to everyone for coming. And again, we will be sending the recording. I do feel like this is something I want to come back to and listen to again, almost like an audio retreat sort of. So I appreciate that. Yeah, your reflections. It's been a lot of fun.
Thanks, Mike. And I should say that the person who introduced me to Ignatius of Loyola is Peter Saunders in Australia, a great psychotherapist and spiritual director whose work with me on the level both of therapy and spirituality influenced me. There's a bunch of poems that are dedicated to Peter Saunders, and I feel like my friendship with the living Peter Saunders is a friendship that opened friendship to one with the dead, which is Ignatius.
Well, thanks again, and great to be with you. And thank you again, everyone. And we'll see you next time at the Jesuit Book Club. Take care.